click record. Good morning. I'm Rebecca Snyder. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, DC Press Association, and I'm delighted to have you here today for bringing data stories to life. Our presenter today is Alexander Pyles, and he's the director of the Capitol News Service Bureau at the University of Maryland. And he works with the Audience Engagement Bureau there, and he helps student journalists use metrics, social media, and other digital storytelling tools to maximize the audience for projects published by CNS and the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism. And in addition to that pretty large portfolio, he teaches related courses on interactive design and social media strategy. So we're delighted and lucky to have him here with us today. So Alex, I'm going to spotlight you and turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today. There should be plenty of time to answer any specific questions that you all have about social media, especially using it to better understand the conversation in the communities that you care about, and also find sources for the stories that you're already working on. But one thing that I hope that you'll take away from this is that social media is a great place, not only to find sources for stories you already know you're doing, but also a great place to find stories that you didn't know you should be doing. So I have this presentation here. If you have a question, stick it in the chat or raise your hand or just unmute and talk. There's enough of us here that we can be pretty informal, like Rebecca said earlier. So I'll put this in the chat later as well, my email address. If you have any questions afterward, it's also on the university's website. I'm happy to take those by email. I'm also AA Pyles on just about every social media network you could imagine. So you could find me there. So the first, the concept, I'll start conceptually, and then I promise we'll get very quickly into some specifics and a couple of examples. But the concept that I teach my students, in addition to audience-focused thinking in journalism, is social listening, which is something that marketing firms, marketing companies, PR agencies have done for much longer than journalism organizations have, I think. And there's a really clear reason for that, is because these marketers, these brands, these companies need to understand what the sentiment is related to their product, right? They need to know what their potential customers want, what they think about what they're getting, what they definitely like, what they want to know more about. But we can take this social listening concept into journalism as well, to better understand, not our customers necessarily, but our readers, our audience, our listeners, right? Our viewers. So when I'm talking about social listening in this presentation and in the context of journalism, I'm talking about what is your audience or potential audience saying online. And I am going to talk pretty much exclusively about online conversations in this discussion, though I think it's important to think about audience engagement as online and in person. And I can talk about that later if there's interest in it. But for online conversations, what our audience is saying, it's something that you should do as a journalist, really ongoing, as part of your beat maintenance. Whether you're an editor or a reporter, or if you're working on an audience team, this is a lot of what you're doing. You may have heard or even done this thing online called just lurking on a social media network, just spending time on a platform and not really being a content creator, but just kind of scrolling through your feed. I'm certainly guilty of this a lot of the time, just scrolling through my feed or my timeline, because I'm curious about what people are talking about, what's happening in the world, right? And that's actually okay. Because we want to take the time to actually understand what these conversations are. But ultimately, we do want to participate, and I can give some examples of what that actually looks like. So I'll show through social listening, we're going to be trying to better understand the sentiment of our audience, right? So positive, negative, or neutral reactions to certain stories or issues, topics. Again, this comes from sort of the brand management world, so that's really important there. though applicable in this case as well, I think. We're going to use this to understand trends a little bit. There's some tools that we can use to see when certain search or certain keywords are becoming more popular over time, both in search and in social. And also understanding the questions that audience members are asking. Because often the questions that users on Twitter are asking, or a subreddit, members of a subreddit on Reddit are asking, are the kinds of questions that we as journalists have the access and the time to go answer and provide some value for our audience in that way. Not just going to the governor's press conference and reporting back to the people what the governor said, but maybe taking some of those audience's questions to that press conference, or taking some of those questions from the audience to a data set, since this was part of a 3-part data journalism workshop. If you understand what users care about around the topic that you're reporting on, then that could give you questions to ask your data set, or to ask the keeper of your data set, or the other, whatever other interviews you're conducting as part of that reporting process. The tools that we're going to look at today are mostly going to be tools that are built into the social media platforms that we already use. And I'm going to talk about 4. I'm going to specifically get into 3, and I'm going to show you one other free option. But there's also lots of different social media monitoring companies that, if you're in a newsroom that feels like it wants to invest more in understanding what audiences care about, there are subscription plans that can automate a lot of the processes that I'm going to describe today, and allow you to achieve them, or allow you to get the information that you want in bulk. Hootsuite is one that the Capitol News Service uses. I mentioned, or Rebecca mentioned, that I'm the director of the audience engagement at Capitol News Service at the University of Maryland. Another one that we use is called CrowdTangle. I've previously used Meltwater. I haven't used the other 2 on here, although Sprout Social has a great website for like basic social media tips. Again, these are all subscription services. So if you're just one person who's trying to do some social media research to better understand your audience, I don't think you really need this unless you're doing 100 searches a day. If you want to be just really targeted, you have all the tools that you need in the free platforms that you already have an account for. So in getting to which accounts you might want to think about targeting, it's important to understand the demographics of some of the different platforms. So one of the assignments that I have my students do in one of my classes every year is they do a series of assignments where they're trying to better understand and get a grasp on just social media platforms in general. And I give them a couple of different articles, and one of them lists every social media platform that is active, that exists, that has members, has active members in that particular year. And the list is hundreds long, right? So social media platforms are much more broad, targeted, diverse than sort of the big ones. I'm going to focus on the big ones here today, just because that's where you're going to get most of your audience. But just know that there are, and I'm happy to provide a link to this article. There are social media networks that are so highly targeted to certain groups that if you were ever doing a story anywhere in that realm, it might be a place where you want to join and try to listen to the users there and understand what they're talking about. For instance, I found I had a student last year, as part of a project, find and start using a social media network that was created exclusively for new mothers, right? And that was the user base. And you went there, and there were a whole lot of conversations that new mothers would be having, helping each other try to navigate this new world, right? So if you were a journalist covering that topic for whatever reason, maybe covering healthcare, that would be a reason that would be a place you might want to be. But the point is you want to understand the demographics of the users of each platform so that you can target the audience that you want to reach. And you determine who you want to target based on what your goals are, what your news organization's goals are, right? If you want to grow in a particular area, then consider that in your targeting. If you know you have an audience in a particular spot and you want to make sure you get pieces of information to them and understand what they think about, then you want to target those platforms, right? And I don't ever say that we should ignore platforms or ignore user groups, but with limited time, we have to make choices, right? So focus attention where your audience is or where you want it to be. And I don't think this will be a shock to anyone in the room today, but I'll say it just because I say it to my students. It does shock them. There's 258.3 million adults in the US, according to the most recent census. And I'm pulling out adults here because all the numbers I'm going to show you going forward are, it's just the adult 18 plus population. But about 18% of US households, so 258.3 million adults, and 18% of households don't have broadband internet connection. So when I mentioned earlier that audience engagement is more than just these online communities, so this is why I think that that's especially important in places where internet access is not necessarily what we in the Baltimore metro area or Baltimore, Washington metro area are accustomed to. You're going to miss certain segments of the audience if you just depend on online tools, is the point there. But here's some adult data looking at, call it the 10 most used social media networks. So the Pew Research Center does this report every year, usually toward the end of the year. So these are 2021 results. We'll have 2022 results later this year or very early next year. I know the graphic is kind of hard to read, but if you look at this top line here, in 2018, they started tracking YouTube. They just hadn't considered it in this social media category before then, but now they do in their research. So they have the numbers from 2018. YouTube is not only one of the few platforms that is rising pretty steeply, but it's also by far the most popular, right? So you're looking at over 75% of United States adults say that they use YouTube, at least sometimes. And that's significant. Now, the way that we use YouTube is, I think much different than the way we use other social media networks, but the fact that it does have the ability to share and comment and customize a feed based on the complex algorithms that drive all of these networks, it falls into this category. So set that aside. Of the more what I consider like social media, we started it to stay in touch with our friends and get photos, and now we just get ads all the time places. Facebook, despite all that you've heard about its demise, still has a whole lot of people using it, right? So 69% of United States adults, pretty evenly split among racial demographics, they're not very evenly split along age lines, say that they use Facebook, right? So that number you can see is at the very least flat and probably diminishing a little bit. So it's something to continue to watch. But just when you look at raw numbers of where people are, there's still a lot of people on this platform, right? At least sometimes adults are using this platform, which means that they are active users. So the percentage that actually has an account that's inactive might even be higher. The next is, of course, a Facebook company, Instagram, right, which is a little over 40%. And then this number right down here, this graphic right down here, I want to point out, and we're going to come back to it here in a little bit. This is Reddit, which also, again, for some reason, Pew didn't track that until more recently. But you can see that is a pretty steep uptick. And we'll talk about what those numbers actually are here going forward. So when I'm suggesting that reporters use social media to try to find sources, I'm starting with sort of the big ones, right? I'm picking the the big social media networks where lots and lots and lots of people are. And you're starting there and you're with your search and trying to narrow it through the search fields available within these individual platforms. So again, because Facebook is so large, because it's the oldest place that where most users are, I do like to recommend using that. But I don't like what I don't like, and I'm going to back in and out at this point and sort of show you some different searches that I've run on these platforms, back in and out of my presentation, that is. So Facebook, I don't like necessarily for finding individuals, although it's fine for that. But that's only really helpful if you are if you're looking for someone specific. What I mean is for finding specific individuals, it's fine. But I'm just looking for a source. I'm not going to run a search just for people. But what I do like to do is use Facebook groups as places where you can find whole communities of people that really care deeply about a particular topic or a particular place. And if that fits into your reporting, that's great. So I'll reverse engineer this search here, but I thought something to talk about, and I'm sorry, I don't know what data sets you've been working with, if you've been part of the other sessions in this data workshop, but a topic that I thought would be interesting to talk about today and show some examples for is sort of the ongoing housing crisis, where folks are having a lot of difficulty finding places to rent, or their rent is going up quite a lot due to inflation and other factors. So I ran a search on Facebook for, I was looking for renters, either people who are renting properties or trying to rent properties, specifically in Baltimore, and that's where I am, right? So when I did that, I found a whole lot. And some of the things that I found were smallish groups that were posting just homes that were for rent in the area, but also groups where users were trying to help each other find places. Here's a really small group that is supposed to be about bad landlords. There's only 2 members. That doesn't work out real well. That's with a landlord search, all right? So I found just these groups right away that tell me a little bit about it. And I also found other places, other groups like this, and I'll run a different search and we'll find even more here in a second. But here's a group called Patterson Park Apartments and Homes for Rent. So this is, Patterson Park is, it's park on the east side of Baltimore, and there's lots of neighborhoods that surround it. So here is a Facebook group that was created for people to post about places that are for rent. There's 193 members of this group. Once I'm actually in here, and this is a public group, that's important. Once I'm actually in here, I can look through and see people. Everyone who's in here is either renting a place, trying to rent out a place, or is renting a place from a landlord, right? So these are all, if you're writing a story about the affordability of rent, these are all potential sources. That's a big shot in the dark, right? Because they're not really having a whole lot of, because we don't know what they're looking for or really where they're from, or if they're still in the area or anything like that. The better way to use this group would be to go through the different posts and look for either the posters or the comments on the posts, and see if there's anyone who is asking a question or telling a story that gives you the impression that they're a potential source for you, or maybe there's asking a question or telling a story that is going to potentially be a good part for a good piece of your story that you could research for them a little bit. So once I've found this group, I can scroll through and look for posts that might work for me, or I can also search within the group for things like rent increase or something like that. So I'm not going to run that. I want to keep this moving along here though, but I will show you just how I got to this group in the first place and show you another little thing that we could search. So let's say I searched rent in Facebook, and it's just going to give me everything. right off the bat, including the marketplace where people are actually renting directly from the Facebook marketplace. But what I'm more interested in, I think, is conversation and things that people are saying. So you can filter by all these different categories here. If I go to groups, and then filter further by location. So I'm in Baltimore, I'm gonna do my story in Baltimore. So I'm gonna do that. And then I could just leave it like this, or if I just want to quickly find some sources or some potential conversations, if I hit public groups, then that's going to slim it down even more so that it's only showing me the groups that I can just get into and read, right? So here right off the bat, Baltimore housing, rooms, apartments, and sublets, it's got 35,000 members. It's a public group. There's 10 posts a day. There's lots of stuff in here potentially. Same for this. This is 4,300 members, Baltimore rental properties. The public groups just let you get in right away and take a look. Often you're going to find good stuff in private groups. It's just a matter of getting accepted to the group and being transparent. Of course, everyone here knows this, but being transparent about who you are and why you want to join the group, right? You're a journalist who's looking for potential stories. But here we are in this very public group with 35,000 members. Someone is renting a house and we've got lots of comments on these posts. These are all potential people who could be sources, or maybe they're even asking a question or saying something in these posts or comments that you can that can be a jumping off point for you, and you can ask them more about it, right? So groups, I think, are a great place to find these folks if you're doing that kind of story. Twitter, right? Back to this. So a much smaller percentage of US adults use it, right? But what we know about Twitter is that it's a highly engaged audience, right? These are very often going to be people who are pretty well attuned to current events. And often we're going to also find experts on Twitter, right? It's a place where lots of academics and officials and lots of journalists are, right? So we can find some people, we can find citizens who have stories to tell, but we can also use it as a place to maybe find an expert that we didn't know anything about before. So this is TweetDeck. And if you haven't seen this before, I can give you some more information afterward, but this is the built-in dashboard for Twitter that lets you do a whole lot more manipulation than just the regular website. So from here, I can run a search, and I ran one earlier just on my landlord. And the reason that I ran a search on my landlord, I'll come back to this in a few minutes, but I'll tell you now also, when you're looking for individual stories on social media, when you're looking for potential sources on a topic, you should think about how a user is actually going to write about their experience, right? So I could search landlord or rent or something like that. But if I add a word like my, or we'll use just the example of my, then it's going to pull in posts where someone is writing, my landlord raised my rent 20%, or my landlord is evicting us at the end of the month, right? So you're going to find posts from users that are using that specific language and potentially find a story that is important to what you're trying to tell your readers. So I did that just by going to the search button here and typing this in. And then it opened up this column where I get a whole bunch of different filters, right? So I could filter it by date. I could filter it by, I don't want certain words in there. Again, I'm reporting in Baltimore, so I set a very small radius around Baltimore City, right? If I'm looking for a particular person, I could do that. That's not what I'm doing in this case. I could also play around with the engagement, and this is actually a really useful tool to use if you're trying to find an expert on a topic. Because if someone is an expert, or if someone's a well-known voice on a topic, they probably have a following larger than your average user, right? And so it's likely then that their posts are getting more engagement than the average user. So if I were to, add in, I want something that has at least 10 likes or at least 20 likes or at least 50 likes, that might help me weed out posts that are from users who have stories to tell, which maybe I don't want that right now, and users who are experts or authorities on the topic, right? So if I just scroll through here, there's several different, my landlord stories here. But if I scroll through, I see this person showing up twice, very recently in the timeline. And if I click on this person, I happen to know this person as a tenant advocate in Baltimore City, right? She's got 10,000 followers. She writes and does a lot of work with tenant advocacy and fair housing, specifically in Baltimore. So if I didn't know that previously, or if I was trying to find someone in a community that I wasn't as familiar with, I've just found this potential expert for my story on, the rental housing market, right? Who's right there in her profile is telling you everything that she cares about and could potentially be a source for you, right? So that's one way to find folks on Twitter. And then I promise I come back to Reddit, and I want to talk about that and then show you just sort of like the treasure trove of stuff on this topic on Reddit. So Reddit wasn't tracked in Pew previously, partially because it was so small. It was really a niche social media network, like an online message board for the whole internet, right? Highly, highly, highly engaged users, very aware of current events, often with very strong opinions, right? There's lots of nonsense on this and every social media platform, right? But 18% of United States adults are using Reddit at least sometimes, and that's up 11 points since 2020. The numbers, the rise has been impressive, right? It's been very fast, right? So that tells me that this is a place where we can do a lot more, I think, as journalists to understand what a community cares about, what the sentiment about certain issues are, and maybe find sources or, again, try to answer some questions that users have. So all I did here, and I'll reverse engineer this real quick as well, but I went to, if you haven't used Reddit before, it's divided into subreddits, which are just smaller subpages within the website based around a particular geography or topic. All right. There's also user accounts who do all the posting in these subreddits, right? So a subreddit is going to be r/whatever the topic or place is, and a user account is going to be u/whatever your username is. So if I go to the Baltimore subreddit and search my rent, I get all of these posts right away about problems with rent. So we have here a user asking if a landlord can arbitrarily increase my rent. And then I've got 21 comments in this thread in a subreddit of users answering the question, having conversation, maybe answering more questions. Here in Baltimore County, a user is saying that their landlord, it's like a property management company, as I read through the thread already, increased their rent 20% on the renewal. And it's got 104 comments, right? So that's a whole lot of conversation around this, and maybe there's people in here that we want to talk to. And then this person has, a 5% increase in rent renewal, right? So there's more sources there. So just doing a very, very simple search in this subreddit has potentially led me to places where I can find some information. So just to get there is very simple. If I go to the homepage of Reddit, Baltimore, it comes up. Here's the entire Baltimore City subreddit. You can scroll through and just see what the most recent posts are. These numbers on the side are a measure of how helpful other users in this community find the post, the larger the number, the better, right? But I can also just run a search once I'm in this Baltimore subreddit for another keyword or key phrase and get back all of this information. And if I click into these individual posts, lots and lots of conversation, comments, links. Again, these are people that maybe you want to reach out to and could become potential sources for you. Or maybe this is just a thread that you read and try to get a better understanding of what the reality on the ground is and gives you questions to ask as you continue your reporting. And I'm not going to run a search through this, but in part because the web application is not quite as good as the mobile application. But Instagram, I mentioned, is another just popular account that is worth looking for. 40% of US adults use it. If you're looking for a source on Instagram, what I find is actually the most useful thing is to find an account that frequently posts about the topic or the place or something like that you're interested in, and then find a large account and scan the comments in that account for what users are commenting back to whoever's posting, because Instagram's not necessarily a place where you're getting evicted from your apartment and you're going to post a picture on the Instagram grid of you getting evicted on your apartment and write a long caption about it. That's not really how people use the platform. But if there's, I don't know, a news post, or if there's a tenant advocacy group in your community that is using Instagram to post resources for residents, people who are having trouble might comment on those posts, and then they could be potential sources for you for your story, right? I mentioned I wanted to show another free option, so I'll do that before I get into tips in general. If you just want to get a very broad grasp on conversation and whether there is conversation around a topic, this is socialsearcher.com, and it will search 11 different internet resources for whatever phrase that you put in. So I don't know that if I've done this this search here yet. So let's see if anything comes up. But let's say I search for mentions of my landlord. So people who have written my landlord in a post. This will take a minute to run. All right. If I start scrolling through here, you'll see posts that include that phrase, and it'll tell you where it pulled it from. So it looks like this is maybe from I could click into it and find out, but this looks like it's like a page set up for landlords. Yeah, these are all website links. Okay, but here we go. Here's a user on Twitter, Francesca. I did not run this search beforehand, so I didn't know what we would find. So here we go. Saying that my landlord is raising my rent by $150, a 13% increase. All right, so this is a person. I don't know where she is. Let's see. Where's Francesca? I click on her account, and she doesn't have a geotag on there. Looks like she might work in public health. But 1 minute ago, she posted this, right? And Social Searcher pulled it in that quickly. So if we're not telling a story, if it doesn't matter to us in this particular moment whether a source is in a certain spot, if it's not, doesn't have to be someone from Baltimore. Here's a person who just had their rent increase, and if it's not a source, it's at least some evidence that this is a thing that's going on and that people are talking about on the internet. Here's more Twitter threads about people being upset about their landlord, and all the way through. If I go to search settings, I could add more keywords. I could say that I want certain exact keywords. I don't want other words. And you can also see all the sources it's searching. If I were doing this again, and if I wanted to take more time right now, we could do the search Without the web, if I just want things that users are posting on certain social media platforms, I could even narrow it down to the big four or the big five if we want to include Reddit, just to get a broader sense. And then once you do all of that, so this website is free. It does a lot for free. It does also have a subscription service like those other places that I mentioned. But it will do a lot for free, including run this report for you. And you can filter the data, sort it by date, or more. We could export it to a spreadsheet, and then we could really filter the data based on location and stuff like that. The one drawback, I guess there's probably more than one, but an additional drawback of Social Searcher is that these are just public posts. So if someone is in a private Facebook group, for instance, you're not going to see posts from there. But anything that's posted publicly to the web, you'll be able to find there. So it's a way to get an idea right at the beginning, maybe, of your process, what's being searched. I mentioned some of these as we went, so I'll just quickly run through, but general search tips for specifically social media search. Try to vary your keywords. Think about how a user is going to write about their experience and what kind of words they're going to use. If you're not getting what you want with a word like evict, try eviction, try car, truck, van, automobile. Basically, if you're looking for information about an accident that someone saw, think about all the potential words that someone could use. It can make the difference between finding that post that you really were looking for. Think in terms of both topic and geography when you're doing a search. And then we already talked about this. Think about how users are going to tell their story. Add me, I, or my to your keyword searches. And then to conclude here, I want to just talk about Google Trends, which this is not social search, right? But Google Trends is great for a couple of reasons. I think one, it can help you determine how much conversation or how much questioning there is around a particular topic right now. What did I say? 69% of users, of Americans, adults, use Facebook. The number for Google is much higher, right? So this is where almost everyone is going if they're searching for something on the internet and not searching for it on the social media platform. So you can get an idea of much broader trends, what people care about. It's just trends.google.com if you haven't used it. And it has a lot of data that's just on their front page, but the real power is in being able to search a term that you care about and then filter it down to your level. So here's an example of a search that I ran on rent, right? And then I filtered it down to Baltimore, and I filtered it down to the last 30 days. This graphic shows interest over time, right? So it's a relative measurement. So 100 is the most interest. And you can see, I don't know about your experience, but around here in the neighborhoods that I live near, there's lots of Johns Hopkins University students, right? And a lot of the rental market in my area is students who are signing leases in the summer for a year, right? So it makes sense to me that there's a whole lot of search activity, or the most search activity in early to mid-July, where I am. But you can see, even though the interest has dipped, it does still exist, which tells me that there's still interest and concern over rent, and it may be worth, if we're not doing a story, it's probably worth thinking about doing a story. And then I like this part down here as well. We get into related queries. Some of them are kind of weird, right? But rent assistance, Maryland, being plus 180% in the last 30 days tells me that people are having trouble paying their rent, right? So if I click into that, I can get a little bit more detail on that search trend. But it also tells me that that the increase in that particular search term related to rent is a potential story idea or question that I might want to ask. Right. Rent cafe, places for rent near me. Yeah. So I think that brings me to the end here, except there's some more resources. I'm happy to provide these slides or these URLs, whatever is best for the group if you're interested in learning more. And aside from that, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have.
All right. Does anyone have any questions for Alex? I feel like you have opened up a whole new world for just catching people in their stray comments and people who have like lots to say, but maybe wouldn't think like, oh, this would be something that's worthy of a story. Like usually they're not, I'm going to call the news media about this, but you can really capture great ideas here. So thank you. George, I see you've popped on. Do you have a question?
No question, but let me ask, have you done any work with the Nextdoor app?
I have, and I think that's another great place to mine for stories. Here's the problem with Nextdoor. I haven't looked at it like in the last couple of months, so maybe they've changed this. But to get into a Nextdoor community, you have to live in that community, right? You have to provide proof you live in that community. So if you are a journalist trying to report on something happening in the communities that you're near enough to get into, then great, right? But if I'm like, for instance, on some of the national investigative projects that I work on, if I'm looking for a neighborhood in Oklahoma City, Nextdoor is not very helpful. I've got to find somebody to get that for me. Because I'm not going to lie about where I live, right? But otherwise, I think it's a great place to. The other nice thing about Nextdoor is, unlike some of these social media networks, which Reddit is the worst offender, Nextdoor you actually get people's real names, which is really great. But yeah, a local story, I think it's a phenomenal resource.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Alex, do you ever come across people who, I'm just thinking about the bias against news media right now and some of the mistrust that we see around journalism or towards journalists. What's, how do people react when you kind of like call them out of the blue, since they're not really, they just think they're sort of screaming into the void in many respects when talking to their friends?
That's a really good question. And I think you have to be really careful with it, and you have to be kind of methodical in your approach. So what I tell everyone is that what you don't want to do is parachute into an online community and just start asking a bunch of questions and calling everybody and talking to everybody, right? Because they don't know who you are, what your intentions are. It's just not a great way to build trust right off the bat. That's why at the beginning of the presentation, I said, you know, it's okay to lurk on the internet. So what I advise is, if you find a community that you think you want to, this requires some foresight, right? And it requires some like long-term planning. But if there's a community where you think there might be stories or potential sources for you, you have to join the community, take some time to understand what users are talking about and caring about, and then start asking questions of your own, or start providing answers to questions just right there in the community, right there in the application. So if somebody writes in a Facebook group that you're a member of, power's out, I don't know what's going on, BGE saying that it's going to be 12 hours. Is that really what's going on? Well, if I'm a reporter and I can be in that community and say, hey, I talked to BGE, this is what's going on. It's actually going to be much longer than 12 hours. You've taken at least one step toward showing that you're a real person and that you're trustworthy, right? You're getting information from them and helping them better understand their world. So I find that rather than just going in and asking a bunch of questions and pushing your stories on folks in these communities, the better thing to do is to take your time, answer questions, and be helpful, and that helps build trust over time. But it's not really an overnight thing.
It
Because you
strikes
do
me
run
that
into that. You do run into that. And I tell students, you know, if you read something in a Facebook group, it doesn't go into the story, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe there's a conversation that happens beforehand, or maybe you just read that post and it gave you an idea for later.
Mhm.
Well, Alex, and from a journalism perspective, it strikes me that technology has changed greatly, but some of the basic principles have not. They're still the same. You can't just use the technology. I mean, it can parachute you into a group and you can start asking 50 questions in 50 minutes, but you are probably not going to get much, if anything, from that except ostracism. You've still got to do the basic work, it sounds like, in cultivating sources and building trust in yourself, so you can then start to edge into gathering information and whether they want their name used in the story and all that. That seem right?
Yeah, I think that's extremely well said, Tom. And the thing about these social communities is that I do think all or most of the same rules apply, and it just allows you to do it if it becomes part of your sort of your reporting diet, and you work it into your workflow. It allows you to do it ultimately at a scale that you wouldn't be able to otherwise.
Absolutely, right.
I see David has a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you've begun to kind of push into Discord at all, because it's like a growing platform and a lot of the communities are no longer video game centric. And it's like been a large issue with like extremes of politics have been cropping up a ton in there.
Yeah, so at the university, we've started to push not only into Discord, but also Twitch. Just looking for, right now, frankly, it's listening, right? And trying to understand what the conversations are, and reacting and making plans based on that. So I think they're good. Both I think are good platforms to start experimenting with. They're just still very small.
Yeah.
George, I'm sorry, David, have you had some success with either?
I'm just on Discord as a user, honestly. I was just kind of curious because like I've seen it pop up a few times in like news stories and stuff about being like people on the political extreme sides using it. I was just curious.
Yeah, and let's talk about that for a second if we can, because I think they are good tools. We didn't talk about TikTok today. I also think TikTok is a really good tool. What's problematic, because I've seen some of the reports that you talk about, David, and I see it more often with TikTok. There is not, in a lot of newsrooms, there is not enough understanding of how these platforms actually work, and how users are using them. So frankly, sometimes stories become stories that shouldn't be, right? Not every TikTok video that gets a whole lot of likes or shares is a TikTok challenge. And that's how it's always reported as, like, it's the slap a teacher challenge. Like, well, no, there was no slap a teacher challenge. There were a couple of videos that were popular, right? You know, just because a video on YouTube gets a bunch of views all of a sudden, that doesn't mean that the video is a viral video, but that's how it's described in a lot of news reports, because there's not a real understanding of, well, what is a viral video? It's not just something that gets a whole lot of views, right? It goes far beyond that. It's more complicated than that, more complicated than we're gonna have time to talk about here. So I think it's really important that as journalists start to use these tools, we really take the time to understand them, just like we do anything else, right? You wouldn't write a budget story without understanding, or you shouldn't write a budget story without understanding how the budget process works, right? And your budget story is going to be better because of that, right? So the same goes for these conversations that are happening in online communities that, quite frankly, not everybody is a part of so far, but there is important stuff. You have to take some time to determine what is real and what isn't real. Like when Larry Hogan was elected governor the first time, he had this huge Facebook group called Change Maryland, right? And he built up this online persona over over several years before he got the Republican nomination and then won twice. And I remember was it the second time? I think the first time he was elected, I was at the Baltimore Sun, and we had somebody in the newsroom who was a social media expert. It was not me. Who the top editor went to that person and said, will you look at his social media presence and what he's doing and tell us if this is if this is a story or if this is not a story? Like, what, you understand this stuff, you have taken the time to research it. Is this a story? Is what he's doing exceptional in any way? And the answer was yes, and we did a story on Change Maryland. So I think that level of reporting has to go into understanding a platform before you can even start to use it in some of the ways that I've described so far today.
Yeah, I think it occurred to me that it really is, this is just a new community or new sets of communities, and they may not be the physical communities that some journalists, are familiar with, but the same reporting rules apply, as Tom said. And I think it's also a great opportunity for younger journalists to bring their own expertise and their skills that are desperately needed. I mean, who wants the olds to, fumble their way through what is viral, what is, to really mess it up, basically.
It doesn't have to, it's not about age though. It's not about age. It's about doing the reporting, right? Mm-hmm. It's just about doing the reporting. And the other thing about these communities, since we have another minute, is that these online communities are providing access to marginalized groups that have not traditionally appeared in coverage in some places, mm-hmm. right? So for instance, on Twitter, there is a large disability Twitter community where folks with disabilities are talking all the time about how the world is not built for them, very intentionally not built for them. And those are stories that you don't read a ton, right? But these users are out there sharing their experiences, and they can help inform our reporting about everything from accessibility to healthcare to, COVID-19 mandates.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great opportunity, and thank you for sharing your wisdom and experience with us. Any other final questions or concerns? And Alex, did you want to just say your email address for the group?
Yes, and I'll put it in the chat as well. So I'm aapyles@umd.edu, and I'd be happy to hear from any of you anytime, or any of your colleagues. Send them to me. I love talking about this stuff.
Terrific. Well, it shows. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Everyone have a wonderful day.
Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Great job.